I'm Jeremy Madsen. I'm the Executive Director of Build It Green, and I'm your host for today. As you join, please drop your favorite greeting into the chat, where in the world you're calling in from. We're here today to hear from the truly remarkable Bronwyn Barry, but we'd also like to give you all a chance to have a conversation both via the chat and in the discussion toward the end. So just encourage you to get warmed up by saying hello and telling us where you're calling in from. So this webinar was inspired by the work of the Policy as an Accelerant working group that Build It Green helped to establish earlier this year. But really the credit for the content today goes to Passive House Network and to Bronwyn. In the working group, we were, really excited to, hear what we were hearing from Bronwyn, and we wanted to, share that with a broader audience. So that's why we're here today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please drop them in the chat, and we will discuss them afterwards. And now I want to introduce Bronwyn. So Bronwyn Barry is a registered architect based in San Francisco, a principal for her firm, Passive House BB, and a board member of the Passive House Network. She has focused on direct implementation by designing and building passive house buildings since 2008. And her advocacy work actually extends internationally. She was an active contributor to the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's Coalition on Buildings, working to develop a global standard for high-performance buildings. Here on this continent, Bronwyn organized and directed California's first all-woman construction crew for Habitat for Humanity before co-founding Passive House California and the North American Passive House Network. She has directly contributed to their policy support programming and edited the policy resource guide. And here in California, Bronwyn has contributed as a subject matter expert on a number of research projects for Lawrence Berkeley Lab. She's worked with California's Code and Standards team on exploring a multifamily passive house reach code. And recently, Bronwyn has been a primary driver on the report she's about to talk to us about, Policy That Works. So again, really excited to be hearing from Bronwyn. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Bronwyn, and you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I really appreciate that. And I'm delighted to be here with the Build It Green audience. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. I've been working with Build It Green for many years. Many of you may know I was one of the starter, was really in the ground when Build It Green started back in the, when was that, late 90s. Here in the Bay Area. So it's fabulous to sort of come back to this home, this big umbrella that we're all working under here. So I'm going to start by getting my screen up here so we can get going. Right, how's that? Can you see my screen? Everybody good?
Yes, thank you.
Fabulous. All right. So as Jeremy mentioned, my role here today is to really share, go deeper into the Policy That Works report that the Passive House Network put out early this year. And some of you may have attended the sort of teaser intro that I gave a little while ago. Right, always interesting to get the first slide moving. Hang on 2 seconds. There we go. So as a path of where we're going today, I'm going to start with covering what we found in the report. So you all have an overview of the highlights in the report. I'm then going to really start sharing stuff that is actually new content specifically developed for today, because we keep mining and finding more gems out of the work that we did in the research. We're going to look at the patterns that we found in all these policies that were really moving high performance buildings forward. Then I'm going to go into very specific examples so that you guys can start to look at that. And this presentation will be shared. I have included links and resources in all the slides, and happy to share them. Really the goal of our Passive House network is to get this information out into the world and share whatever pearls of wisdom we have sort of uncovered, and help work together to move things into a better world. So I'm going to start by opening the umbrella, because some people, oops, back to here. I want to really emphasize the fact that this isn't just about Passive House. A really key finding out of this work was that these patterns, these policy programs and initiatives can be applied to a really wide array of end goals. And I shared this delightful graphic that I have borrowed from the London Energy Transformation Initiative. The acronym is LETI, L-E-T-I. And it's a coalition, much like what Build It Green is sort of convening, of entities all working for the same really big picture goal. How do we create a built environment that actually is both regenerative, restorative, and connected to the planet and the systems, the ecosystems that we all are literally a part of. And it's quite comprehensive, which is what I love about it, but it's also simple. So it really covers all the aspects of the built environment, and provides some nice targets. But what we're really going to be looking at primarily is this sort of first yellow part of this wheel, which is low energy use. So Passive House, primarily, for those of you not familiar with it, is a process and it's a targets, tools, and training a framework that really targets operational building energy use. So you know, it does actually, and we're just not to divert to get too distracted here, we're also working on this embodied carbon aspect. Zero carbon ballast, low carbon supply does incorporate some aspects of those, but I wanted to reiterate that this isn't just about Passive House, and this report really is applicable broadly to many things. That said, why we're using Passive House and why I'm personally very active in promoting and advocating for Passive House is the outcomes that it produces. And I think at the end of the day, what we are all really, the shared goal are these great outcomes for buildings that we're really all aiming for. And in the report, I'll share the punchline first, because that's my typical joke telling process. We found that Passive House buildings over and over and over again actually produce the low energy outcomes that we're all really seeking. So this is a measured report from the benchmarking process that's been in place in Massachusetts, showing the energy use intensity of a wide array of multifamily buildings based in Massachusetts. And over and over again, we see the Passive House buildings actually deliver that reliable, low energy energy use intensity that I think we're all seeking to do. And on the right here, this is from our early policy resource guide document from 2019. We published this article that showed Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency's data collected over 3 years that showed that once the industry and the design community actually gets into doing these buildings, after 3 years, the Passive House buildings actually cost less to build than the code compliant buildings. So great performance outcomes for less money than code compliant. Two big takeaways. That is why, you know, just fundamentally why we really like and are using Passive House. And just sort of some, you know, graphic lexicon of how I'm using this PowerPoint. I'm putting the report covers on the items that are in the report and referenced, so that it's just an easy visual way for you to find where I'm referencing this document, where I'm referencing the specific articles and policies. So let's get started and go back into that report and look at what's inside it and what we found. And we started with our own process map. We really said, okay, how are we going to do this? Where are we going to go and what's the outcome? So we set our destination and we mapped our path retroactively. We started with inventorying all the policies in place that either mentioned or were specifically targeting passive house. We created a big document, it's on our website, of all of these happening all across the US and Canada. We then went and said, okay, what's our metric? What's our metric of success? How are we going to connect the policies in place with the actual outcomes, successful outcomes of implementation? And we said, we're picking certified passive house buildings, ones that have been completed and certified. And I'll go into a little bit of the difference there. There are actually a huge amount of projects built to passive house, but only a small % of them are actually certified. But we said we wanted certified because that's a defensible, verifiable metric of success. We then connected the certified projects with the policies, and we dug into the regions where those policies were really creating more certified projects. And we then looked at the patterns. Then we looked at, okay, how are we as an organization going to see how to move those policies forward? And we crafted an action plan for ourselves. And one of the action plans that we crafted was to disseminate and distribute the information that we found in this report. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. Back in 2017, we started with this sort of graphically mapping. Where were certified passive house professionals located on our continent? Because at the time we could sort of, the databases allowed us to track that. And lo and behold, we saw that New York, Pennsylvania, and British Columbia had a really good baseline critical mass of trained professionals, because we'll see it over and over again, training is at the base of high performance delivery. Then we went and we said, okay, sorry, I'm just going to close those little notices. We then said, let's map the projects. And we started with mapping the number of certified projects in existence across both Canada and the USA. So these were by a unit number. And lo and behold, once again, we found New York, British Columbia, and Pennsylvania were kind of leaders in the field of number of projects. But what we also found, which was quite inspiring and interesting, was that there's actually quite a decent distribution of projects by the numbers in many states. So Washington State, Oregon, also pretty good, Illinois. And here in California, we have a decent amount of certified projects. And again, I want to emphasize these numbers in and of themselves look pretty low as a unit number, but they're actually, if we included in our database all the non-certified or which met the requirements but just didn't take the next step and do certification, these numbers would look quite different. And I've actually keep thinking like, oh, I've got to go back and do that to show that the numbers for certified are quite a lot smaller than the number of existing projects in the US. and Canada. So based on this data set, we said, okay, this still doesn't really tell us as much information about how these policies are really connected to the number of project outcomes, so the realized implementation.
Passive houses.
Oh. So we said, we're going to go one layer further down. And then we then mapped the projects by square foot. So total square foot of all the passive house projects in North America. And it started to really weed out some of the differences in where policies were really being the most effective. Once again, we found the same frontrunners: British Columbia, New York, and Pennsylvania. And what we could really connect and extrapolate from this particular data set was these were much bigger projects. We could say, because by the total square footage numbers, we could see that all these other states that had projects were primarily single family residences. But in British Columbia, New York City, and Pennsylvania, these were much larger projects. And we knew from our database source that most of these were multifamily buildings. So contrary to popular, preconceived ideas, a lot of people think of passive house as only being for single family and only being for residential. And what this data confirmed was passive house adoption in North America is primarily being driven by large multifamily buildings. Really cool aha. We then looked at which were the entities actually implementing the policy in those three regions. And it was this interesting layered mix of cities, states, and utilities. So policy really being driven by those three entities. And 2 and 3, I have to say, were really interesting because most of them were these sort of interesting crossovers, hybrid entities that were state mandated utility funded programs. So, very NYSERDA, Mass Saves, both of those have sort of these interesting intersectionality between being a state mandated utility funded program. So just sort of clarifying that. What we also identified was the policies driving these accelerated regions were competitively run, they were stepped, and they required reporting and monitoring. So they were a data capturing source. And when we then went one layer down and distilled what we identified in those policies, we saw that they had these 3 common features. They included training subsidies. So for a region to really accelerate high performance building and specifically passive house building, we had to have a critical mass of well-trained professionals, which is very logical and not too unexpected. The second one was project subsidies in place. So real carrots that sort of de-risked the developer and the owner community from being able to contemplate and consider doing something a little bit different. And that sort of sweetener existed in many places, and we'll get into that specifically. And the third feature was all of these clearly identified what the end goal was. Most of them said specifically passive house, but many of them used proxy targets that didn't necessarily say passive house, but they were clearly understood by the design community to replicate the passive house targets. So really interesting discovery. We found that all three of these drivers had to be in place for implementation to really scale and be successful. We saw some regions had maybe one or two of these features, but if the third wasn't present, it really didn't move the market forward, and there weren't enough projects really to really create a critical mass and a nice sort of snowball virtuous cycle of just keeping moving things forward. And there were some other insights that I have listed there that we can go into, and they are really detailed and elaborated upon in the report. We also found, although this was not a policy, so I kept it sort of separate in the report, we found that in all of the frontrunner regions, there was a local community of advocates and practitioners that supported policymakers implementing these programs. So in New York, you've got Passive House New York. In Canada, in British Columbia, there was it was originally Canfee West that evolved and became Passive House Canada. And in Pennsylvania, we've got Passive House Pennsylvania, which is a chapter of our Passive House Network entity. So local grassroots activist community really helping move things forward in each region. We also saw, this is a new addition, that in most of the frontrunner regions, baseline code had been roadblocks within the baseline code model have been removed to allow passive house buildings to get implemented without having to sort of work around the baseline code model. And this was really an interesting sort of discovery. We found in some states where they have an alternate compliance path in place in the code, passive house buildings weren't accelerating because they didn't have the other two elements. So Washington State has an alternate compliance pathway that allows you to simply use your passive house model for your code compliance. But New York, Massachusetts, British Columbia all have that, and we're working on that in other regions. So that's really the gist of what's in the report. And as we've sort of been promoting this and talking about it and really propagating what our findings, we keep sort of distilling what we've discovered. And I've started to put this into in language that actually shows how so much of this is connected. And if there's one slide that I would love for all of you to remember today, it's this one. These were the patterns, and I've sort of created these little graphics that almost look like runes that we saw over and over again are inside or inherent in all the policies that we found really accelerating passive house adoption here. And so steps, I'll wait for somebody to mute themselves, or maybe you can mute them for me. Great, thanks. So the patterns were these really interesting stepped or tiered programs that had weighted benefits directly tied to the predicted outcomes. And that's quite a big thing to unpack, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. The second one were these crosshatches, these cross connectors, policies that connected one area of code, one sort of regulatory framework with another one. So, for example, zoning incentives that connected to energy code outcomes. They operate independently, but they connect directly to each other. And over again, we saw these connectors, benchmarking programs, benchmarking requirements that actually connected again further upstream to code compliance, energy code compliance. And then these circular feedback loops. Primarily, these were monitoring and cost reporting that were required by these programs that were then circularly fed back into either REACH codes or baseline code adoption, or back into the same program to really reconfigure and create more refinements in the next iteration of the incentive program or the policy. And what I'd like to really emphasize today is this really fabulous graphic that I borrowed from the Energy Step Code process and website that shows why the steps have to be backcasting, structured so that they already define the end goal and then are created by figuring out the interim steps in a backcasting structure on how to get to that very explicitly and clearly defined end goal. This is the structure that was sort of the big aha and genius of that I feel of the Energy Step Code that's replaced all the REACH codes in British Columbia. And the distinction is it's different from how an iterative code update process is structured, because the clear difference is the incremental approach does not have a clearly defined end goal. So if there's one thing that all of you learned today, I really hope it's this slide. And I'll come back to it later, and we'll, as I move through now into the policy examples, you're going to see these little runes that I've developed on the side to show which pattern the policy is actually using. And the other thing that I found that was so fascinating, was cities, states, and utilities. All of these policies actually connected, and they were quilted together and working effectively together. Whether this was intentional or not, I have yet to really be able to unequivocally make that statement. But it was fascinating to see how these three entities could develop programs that each supported programs and incentives that were working and run and hosted by the other entities. So the quilted, think of a quilt, the top layer, the insulation layer, and the bottom layer. The only way it really works effectively is because it's actually sewn together. So let's get into the specifics here, and I'm going to start with city-led policies and give you some real examples of what cities can actually do. And I think this is sort of where most of us can have impact and can intervene and create policies that really drive high-performance buildings. And I'm going to start with Vancouver, because I think Vancouver did some really innovative policies that cross-connected. You can see the rune on the side here, my crosshatch pattern, cross-connected zoning with high-performance outcomes. They developed, firstly, they set the target. So remember the first thing was saying, okay, where are we going? And they issued a zero emissions building plan back in, I think it was 2014, that said, okay, this is where we are taking our built environment. We're going to this end goal. And they were very specific about what they wanted and where they were taking things. Oops, I'm going to back one. Yikes. They then trained their city staffers. They put all their planning department and building department, well, not all of them, but a good portion over 100 city staffers went through the passive house training that was sort of adapted specifically for their work and their role in this, this really fabulously integrated approach to buildings, so that they understood why and what was, what were the roadblocks that they could remove in their work, in their roles as planners and as building permit reviewers and as city policy developers to really accelerate adoption of this methodology. And lastly, this policy that I'm specifically referring to here, they approved a really fabulous suite of zoning incentives to give carrots, essentially free, no-cost carrots offered by the city to developers in their city that would allow them to go, oh, okay, if I do passive house, and the carrot was, the quid pro quo was, if people wanted to take advantage of these incentives, they had to commit to building certified passive house projects. And they were height relaxation, so slightly taller, not incredibly taller than baseline zoning, side yard relaxations, so setback relaxations to allow retrofits to happen, where you wanted to add a little bit of extra exterior insulation, but you were right on the setback. So it said, okay, we can allow a few inches here or there, and those specifics are here in this document with the link here, and you can go in, city folks or people who want to look at what would that look like. Fabulous example, and a great list. And then there was a third option. You were allowed to apply for a rezoning. You could apply from a residential to a mixed use. You could have then commercial and residential in a zoning if you committed to a building to passive house. So really great carrots, very simple, essentially no cost to the city to add and send a message of where they wanted to go. New York City did pretty much the same thing. They set the target in their One City Built to Last report that came out in 2014, included lots of fabulous passive house examples, and said, okay, this is what we're going to be moving towards. They trained their city staffers. Passive House Network has been honored to train most of the housing, the School Construction Authority staffers in New York City on passive house, and they are utilizing all the building science principles in their new builds and their retrofits of projects. And then they issued RFPs, so requests for proposals. When the city was going to build a new project, they said, we want it to be a certified passive house, fire stations, school retrofits, and a huge affordable housing, new city block development up in Harlem, all built to passive house certified standards. So they used their own projects as a driver and set the example as a city. The city of New York has also done implemented this really interesting, which is essentially a benchmarking law, where they said, and by the way, Boston has done a very similar, implemented a very similar regulation to New York City. They said all the big buildings, those that are usually the big energy hogs in our city, those have to meet a step down emissions cap, so that by 2035 or to 2050 limit, they are not emitting any more than these targets of greenhouse gas emissions for their operational energy. And again, you see on the right here, this is both a stepped, so they're ratcheting back down. So remember, the steps, the direction for steps is not up, but it's always backwards from the end goal. So down to the lowest level here, And what this is doing is it's actually requiring that all these big building owners retrofit their buildings so that they will eventually, by the final date of compliance, all emit less than this 0.0014 tons of CO2 per square foot per year. And interestingly, we're seeing, there's a lot of controversy about this regulation, but it's making building owners, big buildings owners, sit up and go, ooh, okay, I can kind of incrementally retrofit my building each one of these target years to comply, or I can go straight to the end the first time. And this law is not only driving retrofits, but it's driving new buildings too, because every new building, once it's completed, has to also comply with this regulation. So interesting policy. So at the state level, we're looking at, again, I go back up to British Columbia, the BC Energy Step Code, fantastic sort of complete overhaul of the province of British Columbia's REACH code structure. They had a very similar REACH code structure that we do here in California, where each city can sort of figure out what they individually want to do as a REACH code in a local jurisdiction. And they said, okay, that's just too complicated. Each city is sort of moving forward, and it creates real complexity in the industry. So as an architect, as a practitioner, I feel this directly. Every city I go to and I build a new project in, I have to spend an enormous amount of time actually figuring out what this city requires. And it's different from every other city. And this cuts across zoning, energy, and REACH codes. So what British Columbia said is, we're going to create a menu of REACH codes, but a select menu. So we said, okay, this is where we want to go. That's our final destination, the step code number, the step number 5. That's where we are sending and you don't have to go there yet. We created all these intermediary steps of where each city could then adopt one of these steps as their REACH code, knowing that in the next cycle, they would then go up to the next step. And as a regulatory framework, this made it so much simpler for the industry to see, first of all, where they're eventually going. And as sort of the developer and design professional community already then knew what the details were that they would have to deliver to get to the end goal. And most of them said, okay, we're just going to go straight to the end right away. Really brilliant. This REACH code framework also feeds back into the baseline code. So the data and the resources, the information gets fed back into baseline code, and it's allowing the baseline code to actually move faster with better data. Back to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's passive house implementation has been primarily driven by the low-income housing tax credits allocated for affordable housing. This was a rather genius program put in place at the request and by the advocacy and efforts of a handful of people in Pennsylvania, who really said to their low-income housing tax credit folks, hey, what if you created a step tiered differentiator? And I should have actually added the step rune pattern icon here as well. Passive house buildings got 10 points more than all the other green building certifications, because they said it's harder to do. It required a different modeling process, but the outcomes were reliable. And they said, okay, well, if people are going to do it, let's give them 10 additional points. more likely to get the financing available through the state-run financing program. And lo and behold, the outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, were after 3 years of running this program, the passive house buildings performed reliably and ended up costing less money per square foot than their baseline code compliant buildings, because the professional community figured out ways to do this cost effectively. A similar program is, there's a few other programs. So we're going across to New York now. This is a sort of a state utility hybrid through the NYSERDA program. They developed this Buildings of Excellence program, which is a competitive award program open to any buildings, and it's not specific to passive house. That provides real funding, so $250,000 up to $250,000, so real money, for early design explorations. And you can submit an application. It's, as I say, it's an award program. Not everybody gets it. You apply. And this, has really spurred passive house buildings. A big chunk of the buildings that have applied for this funding are using passive house. It's repeated 3 times. This is in the 3rd round. And reporting and tracking of both your modeling and your methodology and your costs is required. So it's got the feedback loop in the structure. And this is really spurring innovation, because it takes the sort of the edge and the risk out of the developer's pocket to drive and to look at really alternates to standard building business as usual procedures. A very similar program is being managed and run in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has been identified as the next huge big front runner. We know they've got 87 passive house multi-family buildings in construction or design right now. In a year, once those are actually completed, those will add to our certified passive house database. And those being spurred by this program. It's focused specifically on multifamily buildings. So New York's program doesn't stipulate what kind of building it has to be. But MassSave said, okay, we want multifamily buildings. We want them to be a high performance. And so we are going to put money in that direction. They also are subsidizing training for professionals, because they know that professionals need to be skilled and get really good at this in order for it to be most cost effective. And they give bonus money and support for post occupancy performance monitoring, because monitoring and collecting the data actually does cost money. It's work. So putting money to support that work is part of this program. Quick review of some utility-led programs. And again, a lot of these are sort of intersectional. Colorado, a very new program that was just initiated and didn't really show up specifically in our, highlighted, but we see these programs coming out, and we want to sort of highlight them because we think they have the qualities to accelerate a marketplace. Xcel Energy, which is the utility operating, an electric utility operating in Colorado, said the Marshall Fire that devastated a huge neighborhood outside of Boulder just very recently, they said, okay, we really do want you to build back better, and we're going to put money towards that. And they said, if you build to Energy Star, you get 10 grand. If you build to Zero Energy Ready, Energy Star version 2, you get $12,500. And then the Energy Star, the new certification program that's have higher targets, you get $17,500. But if you build to Passive House, we will give you $37,500. That is remarkable, And it's really sending a very clear message. It's identified the target. It's created a tiered structure that connects to the expected outcomes, and it tells them the community what the utility wants to see in that region. Flipping back to British Columbia, this was a policy that I found intriguing because it didn't directly subsidize or support projects or professionals. It went further upstream and it supported manufacturers. Manufacturers also need a clear mapped pathway of where the energy code and where the state wants them to go. And without a clear business plan and sales model, they will not deliver high performance products to a market. Because British Columbia put the step code in place that said the top tier of where we are going has Passive House in it as the top 5. They had an alternate pathway as well, but it made it really clear what the end goal was. They then said to manufacturers, okay, windows are really key performance product. And most Passive House people for many years, self-included, we've imported high performance windows because our local manufacturers have not been delivering them because our energy code doesn't require them. They said, we are going to support you. We're going to fund you up to $40,000 per product. And they said, okay, you can hit either Energy Star Most Efficient or Passive House Certified as your target. And we'll give you money to do that. But we've already created a market for you so that manufacturers saw they actually had somewhere to sell this product once they designed it and built it. And this very simple, very cheap program created 6 Passive House certified windows being made in British Columbia today, and 6 Energy Star Most Efficient new windows. That is remarkable because these windows don't just get used for Passive House buildings. They get used for code compliant buildings and retrofits. So that's the circular, it's the connector. This is the trifecta program that I loved. I saw all my patterns kind of coming to play in this policy. And what I saw from that Windows manufacturer Windows subsidy program or incentive program, British Columbia saw that the economics of that was fantastic. This is a report. Oops, I've got the wrong connector here. But this is BC, the finance arm of the state analyzed what products really will drive the local economy. And they said fenestration products will inject a huge amount of local revenue into their tax base to drive increased revenue, local production. So this again, we need to really look and make sure we're connecting our incentive programs to our local economy and that it's got this virtuous feedback loop. So I'm at the third part of my session here. I don't know how I'm doing for time, probably over, I usually am. I've got a few more slides here. I've got 5 more. Where do we start and how do we do this here? Because that's really what the end goal is. Our goal is to have everybody look at how to implement these patterns and use them in their own policies. And I created this little graphic. It's probably a little busier. I'll probably keep refining it, and I need some good graphic help to probably make it cleaner. But really what I saw over and over again, that, you know, all these regions looking at what's working, start with the end goal. Where do we want to go? What's the outcomes? What are the outcomes we want to see? Then promote the structure that and the outcomes, the steps that you've decided and determined and put in place. Training Training, training, training. It's always the thing that gets sort of left off the table, but it is key. And give subsidies to trainings that that work and that actually meet and connect to the outcomes that you've set in your initial target. Then it's sort of a repeat and refine. The NYSERDA program and the mass saves, they run consecutively. They keep going back. It's not just a one-off deal. They come back, they run another round, because refinement is always key. Nobody gets things right the first time, but as they keep doing it, that's where the success really starts. And then create the feedback loop into our code. This is data that we can really capture and go put directly back into the standard code process. So all of this connects the front runners connect the front runners to the back end of the market and move the back end forward faster. And then, of course, nothing is ever complete. The circle has to go right back. Once we sort of achieve the targets, we've always learned more, and we see that we need to add more things in. So we go back and do it again. This is the work that we all know is required of us. So going back to this slide showing where our policies really intersect, where the programs operate within the building development timeline. All projects have to navigate not just energy code. They have to start with entitlement and preliminary design. These are the horizontal overlays that every project has to navigate. We then have to do building codes and energy codes. So the energy code is not our only place to intervene. And then we have this new sort of fabulous potential tool that's being actioned and utilized is benchmarking. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is we mapped where all of these policies are intervening in these systems, both horizontally, and then we started to see how they all were quilted together, connecting all the layers. So good place to start is find where you intersect and see how your policies, programs, incentives actually can quilt together with policies similarly operating and make each of them work better together. So I come back to this, my runes, my patterns. Patterns are something that we see in so many systems, repeating. Many of you are very familiar with Jacobson, Ishikawa, and Alexander's book, Pattern Language. Bronwyn Barry has written a lovely essay that I was sort of reminded of today about patterns in natural systems. We as a human species are really predisposed to patterns. Patterns imbue all of our art, all of our native artwork and our crafts. These are messages that we are very adept at communicating through. And so remember these steps, cross hatches and the circles again and again, and see how you can connect those and find those patterns in your policies and your programs. And I close. I was telling the Build a Green folks, I was listening this morning to Obi Kaufman, who is who I would call him. I know he resists sort of classification, but California Griot, a fantastic connector of art, science, natural ecology systems, philosophy, poetry. And he really looks at and tells these stories of how we can weave ourselves into our natural environment, and how indeed that is what we really have to do. So finding ways for us to connect to where we're living, this place, this incredibly a bountiful and diverse region that we all happen to be blessed to live in is what I'd like to leave you with. And I'd like to thank all the other folks who contributed to this Policy That Works report. None of us do work in isolation. I happened to write the report and sort of distill a lot of the stuff, but all of this came collectively together with the help of many people in our Passive House Network community and to our allies outside. So I'd like to thank everybody for that support. And I'm super excited to see how Build It Green helps us move things forward and creates that network and umbrella to tie us all together.
Well, thank you very much, Bronwyn. This has made my head just go in all sorts of directions, every one of them good. So really, really appreciate it. We do have a few questions here, but we've only got 2 minutes left. So I think we'll just have to do this again and then ask a whole bunch of questions. But there's a couple of things that actually jumped out to me that I just want to kind of raise up. And, you kind of wrapped it up by talking about weaving, and we don't do this all in isolation. And, one of the things that really jumped out at me, and again, this whole talk was sparked by some of the work that we've been doing in our policies and accelerant working group. And I loved hearing about how in, various different cities that have been working on this and are kind of like the ones you featured, that in addition to, kind of training local workers, in addition to subsidies and having the end goal, it was actually really training within the city government too, and bringing all of these different players, from planners to code enforcement to, the folks working on zoning, into alignment. There was also that issue of, Vancouver, New York, Pennsylvania, I think you mentioned, citizen groups, working together, I assume in conjunction with some of those folks in government and some of the folks in the private sector. And so this question of alignment is one that has come up a lot for us. And I think, what you just did here really, really highlighted that. So I know folks are probably starting to jump. We only have a minute or so left. So as we wrap up, I want to do four things. One, thanks to Bronwyn for doing the presentation. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Third is, I think Jenny just dropped it in here, but check out the report from Bronwyn. It is amazing. And, there's only so much you can do with it here in an hour. So just read it through. And then fourth, I guess, if you like this, sign up for the Build It Green newsletter, be part of this network we're creating, really intersectional effort working on, issues of environment, affordability, and social equity in housing here in California, and really trying to bring to life a lot of what Bronwyn has talked about today. So with that, we are right at the top of the hour. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.